Okay, guys, we will make a start now. So, welcome everyone to our A Level AQA Biology session. Um, in today's lesson, we are going to be looking at ATP. Okay, so we're nearly towards the end of this unit, okay, of nucleic acids. We only have one more lesson after this. We have ATP now, and then in our next lesson, we're going to be looking at water and inorganic ions. So that would be the last lesson. But today is the penultimate lesson of this unit, nucleic acids, and then we've got all of biological molecules out of the way, and then we can move on to our next unit. Okay, so in today's lesson, we are looking at ATP. As I mentioned, we're going to be starting off by looking at the structure of ATP, what it actually is, and why it's important. And then we're going to move on to the properties of ATP, and then we're going to finish off the lesson by looking at some exam questions. Okay. So this is what the specification says, okay? And the part of ATP is actually really simple. The specification highlights all the points that you need to know. So we are literally going to be following all the points which have been listed in the specification throughout this lesson. So have any um, if you guys have any sort of questions um, that you need answering, just let me know at any point, and I will be more than happy to answer them for you. Okay, so moving on, what is ATP? That's what we're starting off with. Okay, well, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Okay, that's the long form of what ATP is. Okay, we know it as ATP, and because on the specification, it is abbreviated to ATP. We can call it ATP. We don't need to write out this full name, adenosine triphosphate. Anything which is abbreviated on the spec, you can abbreviate whenever you're writing it in your answers. Anything which is not abbreviated on the spec, you will have to write the full form of it. But ATP, you can just write ATP because it is abbreviated on the spec. And it stands for adenosine triphosphate. And the function of ATP, well, ATP is released from the mitochondria. As you probably remember from GCSE, you learned about the mitochondria in cells and you looked at the mitochondria as being the powerhouse of the cell, and the mitochondria would release energy whenever it is required. How does it release this energy? Well, it contains this thing called ATP, and ATP allows it to release energy. Okay, so ATP acts as an immediate source of energy. And this will make more sense when we look at the structure of ATP, of why it can act as an immediate source of energy. Okay, but just for sort of reference points, when we're looking at ATP, in this sort of case, it's basically sort of a build on from GCSE. Okay, so we've got GCSE where we look at sort of a cell, and then you have the nucleus, and then you have these mitochondria. These mitochondria over here, they are the powerhouse of the cell, and they are going to be releasing energy for all the biological processes, allowing them to occur within the cell. Okay, ATP is basically the explanation of how these biological processes occur and how the energy supports these biological processes to occur. Okay, and it's really vital that all cells have this constant supply of ATP because cells are always requiring energy. Okay, and because they require this energy, they will they need this energy to carry out sort of enzyme reactions, of reactions which occur in digestion, sort of breaking sort of molecules into smaller bits and pieces, and they occur all around the body. We wouldn't be able to contract our muscles without ATP because we need energy to contract our muscles. So it's really important that all these cells have enough ATP so they can release enough energy for all these processes which occur within our body. Contracting of muscles, movement, breathing, all of this requires energy. Okay, and in order to have the energy, we need ATP and a healthy amount of storage in each cell. Okay, now if we move on to the structure of ATP, there are three main components of ATP. Okay, we've got adenine, and you probably remember adenine from where we looked at it before. Remember, we looked at A pairs with T, and C pairs with G. It's not really relevant, but over here, A was adenine. Okay, and we looked at that a couple of lessons back. And adenine all is part of the nucleotide, and it's a nitrogenous base. Okay, so the structure of ATP contains adenine, a nitrogenous base, which we've looked at in DNA replication. Okay, it also contains ribose, which is a pentose sugar. Okay, remember DNA contains deoxyribose. Again, we looked at here at the start of this unit, deoxyribose, and we looked at the phosphodiester bonds that form between the phosphate and the deoxyribose, which act as strong covalent bonds, and we built on our knowledge from there. So it contains ribose. We've seen ribose before. Okay, it's a pentose sugar. Okay, actually, we've not seen ribose before. We've seen deoxyribose. Okay, but ribose we will come across later on in a further in a later unit. Okay, but all you need to know, we've seen pentose sugar before. And finally, it has three inorganic phosphate groups. Okay, now this is something that we haven't seen yet. Okay, now inorganic phosphate groups, I'll come on to them, but basically these are the groups which are broken and provide energy so that muscle contraction can occur. Any biological processes within the body can occur. And that's the purpose of these phosphate groups. Okay, and this is the structure of ATP. Okay, and now, as I mentioned, there were three main components of ATP. We've got adenine, which is the nitrogenous base over here. We've got ribose, which is the pentose sugar. And remember, it has a shape of a pentagon whenever we're drawing it out. And then we've got three inorganic phosphate groups. Now, inorganic just means that they don't contain carbon atoms. Okay, these are inorganic. Now, if any of you do chemistry, you will probably realize that there are three components to chemistry. There is the physical component for chemistry, there is the organic component of chemistry, and then there's the inorganic component of chemistry. Now, the inorganic component of chemistry is anything which includes sort of the periodic table of the left-hand side of the periodic table. And you look for trends in sort of reactivity and all of that sort. The organic part of chemistry is basically where all your sort of alkenes come in, your sort of reaction mechanisms come in. Okay, and these phosphate groups, we have three of them, and they're inorganic, which means that they don't contain carbon atoms. Okay, so they don't contain carbon atoms. Inorganic, organic means carbon containing. In before organic makes it the opposite. It doesn't contain any carbon atoms. And that's basically the structure of ATP. Okay, and now I've seen exam questions which have asked to draw out the structure of ATP. So make sure that you know this structure. You have a pentose sugar, which is ribose. Don't write deoxyribose because that is incorrect. It is ribose. You have a nitrogenous base, which is adenine. And then the ribose, the pentose sugar, is connected to three phosphate groups. Okay, don't connect the phosphate groups to the adenine because they are not connected to the adenine. They are connected to the ribose. And there's a reason why that ribose has five sides, five corners. So one can connect to adenine and the other one can connect to phosphate groups which are attached to each other. Okay, and just a point that I've already mentioned, the phosphate groups are inorganic as they don't contain any carbon atoms. Okay, just remember that some mark schemes are picky and they require you to put the inorganic phosphate. Sometimes you don't need to write the whole thing. Sometimes you can write PI. Okay, PI means phosphate inorganic. Okay, so this is the structure of ATP that you need to be familiar with. Okay, and so we've looked at why we have ATP. We've looked at the structure of ATP. Now we need to look at the main reaction that produces ATP. How do we produce ATP and how do we break down ATP for it to be used within our body? Okay, this is the reaction. ATP reacts with H2O. Remember, ATP is present in the mitochondria. Okay, so ATP is present in the mitochondria. And whenever energy needs to be used, whenever there is a requirement of energy, this ATP is broken down. Okay, so we had I'm just quickly going to sketch the ATP that we had. Okay, so we had this sort of ATP. ATP, and we know that these were inorganic phosphates. Okay, these were inorganic phosphates. Now, we know that this needs to be sort of releasing energy. How is energy released? Well, this ATP reacts with water, and when it reacts with water, the phosphate is released. When the phosphate is released, energy is also released. Okay, and I'll show you how this actually happens. But you're probably thinking we're reacting with water. There's another reaction. Whenever you react with anything with water, there's the specific name of a reaction, and that's a condensation reaction. Sorry, not a condensation reaction, a hydrolysis reaction. Okay, just a minute. Okay. Whenever we react something with water, that's a hydrolysis reaction. Okay, so using water, we are breaking down ATP into ADP. Okay, that's a hydrolysis reaction that you need to be familiar with. Okay, so that's the chemical reaction. In our cells, we have the mitochondria. We know the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and the mitochondria is going to release energy for biological processes to occur, such as muscle contraction, enzyme action, and we need that energy. Each mitochondria has a store of ATP. Now that ATP needs to produce energy somehow. So that ATP is reacted with water. Water will break one of the inorganic phosphates. Out of these three phosphates, one of the inorganic phosphates will break, and that will produce the energy that is required for that process to occur. Now, when that phosphate is broken, we don't have three phosphates anymore, do we? We would only have two phosphates. Okay, so this would turn into two phosphates. We would have sort of the pentose sugar still. We would have the adenine over here, but this time we would only have two phosphates because we have broken this last phosphate that was originally meant to be there. So we have broken one inorganic phosphate. Okay, that's what we've done there. Okay, and that's why, remember, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Instead of adenosine triphosphate, we're forming ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, because we only have two phosphates left over. And this will explain it a bit more. ADP is adenosine diphosphate and only contains two phosphates. To produce ADP and a phosphate group, ATP hydrolase is the enzyme which is used. To produce ATP and water, ATP synthase is the enzyme which is used. Okay, so over here there is two key enzymes that you also need to be familiar with. Okay, just a minute. Okay. There are also two enzymes that you need to be familiar with, and that is ATP hydrolase, okay, which I'm going to highlight now, ATP hydrolase over here, and ATP synthase. Okay, these are the two enzymes that you need to be familiar with. Okay, when we are converting ATP to ADP, what we are doing is we're reacting it with water, and we are producing um, an inorganic phosphate. An inorganic phosphate along with a lot of energy. Okay, so that's what's happening. Now, as I mentioned, in order for this reaction to take place, this is a hydrolysis reaction, right? So we know that this is a hydrolysis reaction because we are using a molecule of water in the process. Okay, we are hydrolyzing the ATP. So an enzyme needs to be present for this reaction to occur. In order for ATP to be converted into ADP, an enzyme needs to be present, and the enzyme is ATP hydrolase. Okay. Now, if we were going the other way around, for example, we don't need the ATP, we have ADP, and we can convert it back into ATP. Okay, we can convert ADP back into ATP if we have an extra storage as well. Okay, and that reaction, so we would do ADP, we would react it with our inorganic phosphate, and that would produce our ATP and water. And if we're producing water in the process, this is a condensation reaction. It's a condensation reaction. However, for this reaction to occur, as you can see from ADP, we are synthesizing ATP. So the enzyme that we are going to use here is going to be called ATP synthase. Okay, that's the enzyme that we are going to use over here. So we had ATP hydrolase. Over here, we're using ATP synthase. Okay, and if I was to summarize from the slide about what you need to know, well, you need to know this reaction. Okay, you need to know the reaction. Minute. Okay, you need to know this, just a second, this reaction. Okay, and when I'm talking about reaction, I mean this reaction over here. ATP plus H2O is a reversible reaction to produce ADP and PI and energy. Okay, you also need to know the enzymes which are involved, the enzymes, and you also need to know the type of reaction, if it's a hydrolysis reaction or if it's a condensation reaction. Okay, so those are the three main points that you need to know from this slide. If I was just to summarize, ATP is present in mitochondria. Whenever we need energy, there has to be a supply of ATP present within our cells. How does that ATP release energy? Well, that ATP reacts with H2O with water, catalyzed by ATP hydrolase to produce ADP and an inorganic phosphate along with a lot of energy. And this is a hydrolysis reaction because we are using a molecule of water in the process. The ADP can also react with the inorganic phosphate to synthesize ATP. And because we're synthesizing ATP and releasing a molecule of water, we're using the enzyme ATP synthase. And because we're releasing a molecule of water, this is a condensation reaction. Okay, so that's the reaction of ATP. Now, ATP needs to be present in mitochondria, as you are aware of, but it also acts as an immediate source of energy. That's one of the main reasons that we need to have ATP within our cells, because sometimes, for example, reflex actions, we need to suddenly move, or if we're running away, or if we're so if we need a sudden source of energy to defend ourselves, okay, ATP is there for that reason. Okay, ATP can act as an immediate source of energy as only one bond needs to be hydrolyzed. And again, if I draw that picture of ATP that you need to be aware of, we have our pentose sugar, and then we have our three inorganic phosphates over here. In order for this ATP, this is ATP, in order for this to release energy, only one bond needs to be broken. And I'm just going to switch color. Only one bond needs to be broken. Okay, only one inorganic phosphate needs to be broken. Okay, and if that one inorganic phosphate is broken, then enough energy is going to be released collectively, along with many other ATP molecules, for that reaction or biological process or muscle contraction to occur. Okay, so it acts as an immediate source of energy. Normally, if we're looking at glucose or if we're looking at other sources of energy which are present within our body, they will require many bonds to be broken. Okay, for example, glucose requires so many bonds to be broken that it can't act as an immediate source of energy because it's very time consuming to break those bonds. It will require like 5 or 6 bonds to be broken. And because more bonds are needed to be broken, it will take up more time. So it can't act as that immediate source of energy, so for reflex, muscle contraction, or anything like that. That's why we have ATP. So it's already within our cells. It can act as an immediate source of energy whenever we need it. Okay. Now, the next thing that we are going to be talking about is phosphorylation. Okay, now phosphorylation isn't that difficult. Basically, we've already looked at a chemical reaction, and that is, for example, ATP reacting with water, and that's producing ADP, inorganic phosphate, and a lot of energy. We've already looked at this reaction. Now, we know that because one phosphate group is breaking off from the original ATP, here it is, that's causing the release in energy because the bond has been broken. Okay, that's releasing the energy. But what will this phosphate do? Okay, what will this phosphate do? Just a minute. Okay, what will this phosphate actually do? Okay, we've broken the bond, right? We've just got a phosphate. What is that phosphate going to do? Okay, now there are two things that that phosphate can do. One is that it can combine with another ADP molecule. So it can combine with ADP to reform ATP. Okay, we've already looked at this. That phosphate group that has broken down can combine with a different ADP molecule and it can reform the ATP so we have a constant supply. There is also one other thing that it can do. It can phosphorylate another compound. Okay, and this is what phosphorylation is. That this phosphate group that has broken off from the ATP during the hydrolysis reaction, it can bond to a different compound. For example, if we have glucose, okay, this phosphate group can bond to glucose and it can make it more reactive, so it can release more energy in a small amount of time. Okay, so this inorganic phosphate that we've been talking about, this can go and combine with a different compound within the bloodstream, and it can make that compound more reactive. Okay, so we can release more energy and it can be more useful for our body. Okay, and this happens to glucose. Okay, so respiration we know uses glucose, and if we wanted a recap of respiration, we have glucose reacting with oxygen, and we produce our carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so that's what we produce. Now, glucose needs to react, right? How does glucose react? Now, there's a full whole unit on respiration. That is a later topic. However, in order for glucose to react, in order for it to sort of take part in the respiring process, it needs to become a bit more reactive. Okay, it's very unreactive. It needs to become a bit more reactive. Okay, and that's partly because glucose has many bonds. In order for it to become reactive, this phosphate can combine with glucose. So this inorganic phosphate that we have lost from ATP over here can go on and combine with this glucose and make the glucose much more reactive. Okay, and that means respiration can happen at a much quicker rate. Okay, and that's basically phosphorylation. Phosphorylation is basically when ATP is broken down, we know that the phosphate group has detached from ATP to form ADP and PI. Where is that inorganic phosphate group going to go? Well, it can combine with ADP to reform ATP, or it can go on and combine with a different compound, and it can make that compound more reactive because phosphate groups are very reactive, and that's why ATP is able to release that influx in energy. Okay, now, the last thing that we are going to be looking at before we move on to, I think, 4 exam questions is basically the properties of ATP. And this is an area of aspect that gets commonly assessed, that is very commonly assessed. And I have 2 slides of the properties of ATP. So you're required to know the properties of ATP, and sometimes you could be asked to link it with glucose. How is it different to glucose? And that's what we're going to go through. So ATP releases a small manageable amount of energy. So no energy is wasted. Glucose, on the other hand, releases a lot of energy, so more is wasted. It could also cause the cells to overheat. Okay, so this is a key point, and most of these points are just learning points. Yeah, you just need to make a flashcard on it, you just need to make notes on it, and you just need to learn it. Okay, and in an exam question, when it comes up, you're able to bang it there in the answer. So ATP releases a small manageable amount of energy, so no energy is wasted. Whereas when you're using glucose, you normally have a lot of bonds, so more time taken to break the bonds, and therefore more energy is released. And sometimes you may not need to use all of the energy. So it's some of the energy can also be wasted. Sometimes you could produce too much of the energy and it could cause cell damage. It could cause the cell to overheat. So the first property that we're ideally looking at is that ATP releases a small, manageable amount of energy, so no energy is wasted. And remember, you have a lot of ATP molecules, so depending on how much energy is required, we can keep adding small amounts of energy if we need more. Okay? It doesn't overwhelm you with energy. It gives you a small but manageable amount of energy compared to your body, so your body knows how much to use. ATP is small and soluble, so it can be easily transported around cells like glucose. Okay, this is a similarity of glucose. Okay, so it's small and soluble, so it can be transported around cells. Okay, only one bond needs to be hydrolyzed to release energy, which means more energy is released much faster. Okay, and this is the point that I've been reiterating all through the lesson. Okay, so glucose would need several bonds to be broken in order to release energy. Okay, so these are the first three properties of ATP that we've gone through. There are another two properties of ATP that I am going to go through, and you don't need to learn them all, but it's really important that you know at least three of them so you can talk about them for the exam. Okay. So ATP can transfer energy to another molecule by transferring one of its phosphate groups. This can make other compounds more reactive. Okay, and this is a property of ATP, and this is basically phosphorylation, what we've already spoken about. Okay, so this is basically phosphorylation. So we've got phosphorylation. So ATP can transfer energy to another molecule by transferring one of its phosphate groups. Okay, and that's the whole phosphorylation process that we have gone through. And simply, glucose cannot do this as it doesn't have any other, it doesn't have any phosphate groups. And finally, ATP cannot pass out of cells. Okay, so ATP stays within the cells. Because it stays within the cells will have an immediate supply of energy. There will always be a supply of energy if the cell needs it. Whereas glucose can move into and out of cells through the bloodstream. Okay, and because it can move through the bloodstream in and out of cells, a cell can run out of glucose. Okay, but whereas ATP is small. It stays within cells. It's enclosed by the membrane. It cannot move out of cells, and because it cannot move out of cells, it will always act as an immediate source of energy. Okay, so those are the five properties of ATP that I've gone through. And I would recommend learning at least three. They're not that difficult. The phosphorylation one, if you've learned ATP, you should know about phosphorylation. And put simply, glucose doesn't do that. That's one easy one. I've been iterating that glucose has several bonds, therefore, it cannot act as a it cannot be hydrolyzed quickly enough. So ATP is much faster at being hydrolyzed because only one bond needs to be hydrolyzed. ATP is present within cells, okay? And because it's present within cells, it can act as an immediate source of energy and it releases energy in small manageable amounts because ATP is smaller than glucose. It only has one bond, so you can use how many ATPs you want depending on how much energy is required.